Hey, welcome to week two of our series, Stand, Stories of Courage from the book of Daniel. We've learned last week about standing out. This week we're going to talk about standing up. And we've got 5 weeks of this, and all the weeks are coming out of the book of Daniel, but I think there's some of the most profound things because I think the Word of God teaches us so many things that are relevant. And Daniel may be one of the, I think Daniel and the book of Esther may be the two main books that I would recommend people read through if they're concerned about the way things are today in today's society. Those two will help you understand, because both Esther and Daniel made it through dark days in places where the government wasn't good, society wasn't good, all those things were bad, and so just need to keep an eye on that. But we're in the book of Daniel today, and we started this series last week talking about stand out, and we looked at that. And we said this: if you take a stand, and it's going to deal with all these, but if you take a stand in the right way, at the right time, for the right reasons, it can change the course and direction of your life. And that's really, isn't that what you want? I don't want my life always going in the wrong way. It seems like I always managed to, Murphy's Law is always in effect in my life. And maybe it's not in yours, but anything that could go wrong usually does go wrong. And as we were talking, I think Randall said it in our Sunday school class this morning, I make some bonehead decisions, and God seems to bless it anyway. And that's how I feel. God wants to bless us, and that's the good thing. But we do need to take a stand, and that's what the book of Daniel really teaches us. Daniel, we saw last week, he was that guy that stood out at the age, and remember we talked about last week in Daniel chapter 1, how he was about 14, 15 years old when he gets taken from his home in Jerusalem. His parents and all of his family members are killed in front of him, and he's changed his name, changed all these different things, and Daniel had to learn how to stand out in the right way, because we know that standing out in the wrong way doesn't help either, and that's what's great. And Daniel gives us this whole idea that he stood out in such a way that he did it when he was young, 14, 15, and by the time the book of Daniel ends, he's going to be about 90 years old, in his 90s, and he's still doing the same kind of stuff, and that's what gives us hope, because we also know this, the opposite's true. If we compromise, which is the opposite of taking the stand, can cost, and we compromise on the wrong things in the wrong ways, it can cost you more than you ever imagined. And that's the bottom line for this series that we talked about. Now, last week we talked about how do I stand out in a society that's so bad. This week the question for us is, how do we stand up for what is right? And that is a question, I don't know if you just resonate right away, but I think that's one of those things we're on concern. In fact, right now there's a lot of people telling you, you got to stand up and do this, you got to do this, you got to do this. I'm not here to give you another protest that you need to join. I'm not here to give you a political party to join, because that's what we've been telling people for years now. Do these things and you'll stand up. That's not really what the Bible says, though. And that's what I want to take a look at today. But as we get into this, what I have to mention today is that everybody here fits into pretty much one of two categories. And I think when we get down to it, you talk about these categories, they both have their ups and downs on them, and so I want to be fair and kind. Sometimes I fit in both of them, and you might vacillate, and you may not be sure. Most of us, I think, we're going to identify this first category. But when it comes to this standing up, we have to talk about the subject of confrontation. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't like confrontation. Anybody else? I don't really like, Donnie and I are the only two guys that don't like confrontation. The rest of you guys are all like, rage addicts, huh? So I'm dealing with some rage addicts today. No, honestly, how many of you guys really like confrontation? I try and avoid. Okay, there's 3. Okay, so I see we got a lot of confrontational people here this morning. It's going to be a tough crowd this morning. You guys relax a little bit and enjoy this. Okay, it may not be fun, but I think there are 2 extremes when we get down to this category of standing up that we have to face before we really delve into it. And the first one we talk about is those who are unwilling to confront. Unwilling to confront. Most of us, and you don't have to raise your hand on this one, even though you didn't on the last one either. Most of us, I think, probably would say, yeah, I fit more into this whole extreme of, I'm really not comfortable doing that, because that's just the nature of it. In fact, I remember, and I was sitting down this morning thinking about this. It's probably close to 30 years ago. I was youth pastor, and I came into this church, and I think we had about somewhere between 10 and 15 kids, and I was trying to get to know them. I had to understand them a little bit because I was in my mid to late 20s, and so I started off by asking them some questions that they were going to write their responses, because I didn't want them to have to blurt out. I wanted the honest answers, but I wanted to discuss some of these things and see where they were thinking. So I asked them a survey. And in the survey, I asked them, Now, just so you know who these kids were, these were kids whose parents were pretty much Sunday school teachers, deacons' kids, pastors' kids, yeah, the bad kids. I was one, so I can say that. Pastors' kids, all those kind of kids. So I'm not talking about kids who didn't come from homes that understood. These kids had grown up in church. They'd gone, seen all the flannelgraph stories you've seen. So this group, I asked them some questions that I just want to get a feel for what they were thinking. And one of the questions I asked was, I put a lot of hypotheticals in there, but I said, imagine yourself if you had a friend who was putting themselves in a situation where they were doing something dangerous to themselves, dangerous and I gave them some hypotheticals like they were doing drugs, illegal drugs. Now, I realize the culture has changed a lot in 30 years, and people don't think of drugs as much as illegal, but they were doing illegal drugs. I said, or imagine yourself as you know your friend is in a relationship. Maybe you've got as a girl, you have a girlfriend that she's put herself in a situation where her boyfriend they're having premarital sex, and she's getting pregnant, and she doesn't want to tell her parents, and she doesn't know what to do, and she's in a situation where she's distressed physically, and she's being controlled by her boyfriend because he wants things that she's not sure she wants, and they're not living up to God's standards. What would you do? And one of the choices I gave them is you go and tell the authority in their lives, whether it's their parent or guardian or whoever that is in charge of them. 95% of these kids said, no way. I wouldn't say a word. Even if it's a danger to their life, I would not say a word. Now, this is 30 years ago. I wouldn't say a word about this to anybody because it's none of my business. What they're really saying is, I'm unwilling to get involved in this stickiness. Even though, and when I asked this question, one of the leading up to this thoughts was, how tight are you with this person? You've got to realize this is your best friend. And they were like, yeah, we understand it's your best friend. No way. It's none of my business. I don't have the right to say anything. They said things like, we should live and let live. In a church setting, once again. And probably my favorite statement they made, one of them said, who am I to judge what is right for someone else in their life? Maybe drugs and alcohol and premarital sex and all those things are good for somebody. Wow. And I thought, right now we've got a problem that's brewing, and I think a lot of us, if we're honest with ourselves, that's how we feel. That's how we feel when we get into uncomfortable situations. Say you're at the grocery store and you see something uncomfortable happening, like, it's not my right to say anything. It's not my right to step in there, stand up. I'm unwilling to confront. And some of it's because we don't understand how to confront, and that's what we're going to deal with today. But group number 2, maybe they scare me even more because they're not the ones who are just unwilling. They're the ones who love to confront. Maybe some of you guys, the reason you didn't raise your hand in the beginning is you're one of those. They confront unlovingly. There's a term for that in this realm. They're the drive-by confrontationalists, right? Just like a drive-by shooting, they like to drive by you and give you a pounding of the truth. I grew up in that kind of background in church where we had churches that were very unloving because God bless it, the truth is the truth, and we ought to hurt people with it anytime we can. Not true, by the way, not true. I think most of you know that. But theirs are the bulldozers, the bullies of the church. We love to get up in somebody's face and tell them that they're living in sin, brother. In fact, they're the first people that, in a church are going to call the pastor and say, Pastor, when are we going to exercise some church discipline? Yeah. And we find ourselves, unfortunately, most of us, we find ourselves in one of those two. Now, as I've explained these, probably most of you are like, yeah, I'm probably more in group 1 than group 2 because everybody's like, no. But you know what? Both those extremes are wrong. That's the Bible today. And we're going to look at this and you're going to say, well, how did this come out of the book of Daniel? It is true. See, the problem with both these extremes, either we're unwilling or unloving in our confrontation, is the fact that neither one take a stand in the right way at the right time. See, when we are unwilling, we don't take a stand for anything, and so that obviously doesn't work. But when we're unloving in our confrontation, that means we're standing up for the wrong things at the wrong time in the wrong way. And that doesn't work either. And that's where we find Christianity today. And that's why, if you ever wondered, like, why so many people, have you ever met somebody and they're like, I don't like Christians at all? Like, and this is how I best describe it. I grew up, child of the 70s, My dad worked for the government. Most of you know, I think my dad was a pastor and he was a CIA agent. But in the 70s, we had this little deal that we got ourselves into over in the Middle East called the Iranian hostage situation. I remember distinctly all the talk that went on in our house about this. My dad knew most of those guys in the embassy that were taking hostages because he was co-workers with them. I just remember thinking, every day those guys, they would show pictures of, and if you remember that time period, for those of you that are old enough, some of you younger people are like, I have no clue what you're talking about. But it just bothered me because I'd wake up and I'd turn on the TV and I'd see images of these Iranians holding up American flags, holding up pictures of Ronald Reagan, or no, it wasn't Ronald Reagan, it was Jimmy Carter and the rest of those guys at that time, and they're burning our flag and they're yelling things about death to America. And I was thinking, what is their deal? They don't know me. Why do they hate me so much? That feeling bothered me so much, and I don't know if it bothered anybody else during that time period, but you know that's how the world looks at Christians who are unloving. They're going, why do you hate me so much? I haven't done anything to you. Why are you so mean? I don't want to go to your church. You're going to make me feel bad, and I'm not here to make you feel bad. I really am not, and if we've done that, I don't apologize right off the top of that. We're all the same. There is no perfect person here. I don't care how long somebody's been saved. We're all sinners. There's none righteous, no, not one. That's Bible truth, and that's where we're at. But how do we look and find this thing? Well, it's funny that we get to this because if you have your Bibles today, we're in the book of Daniel in chapter number 4. And before I get to reading our passage, because it's a lengthy one, I got to set the backdrop. Now, we were in Daniel chapter 1 last week, and time has passed. Last week, Daniel's 14, 15 years old. This week, he's 45 to 50. Okay, so 30 plus years have passed in his life, and things have changed. Of course, there's been some big events in Daniel chapter 2. You can go back sometime and read this on your own. It's the first set of dreams that Nebuchadnezzar, the king, has, and it's about an image, and that's a whole big story, and we're not dealing with that today. But that happened, and Daniel came out as the good guy in that one. And then in Daniel chapter 3, it's the famous story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. And that was another huge event. Daniel chapter 4, though, takes a different turn. And it's not one of these stories like that, the stories of cool things. It is another story about a dream. And so what happens here is we talked about this guy, King Nebuchadnezzar. And just to remind you who King Nebuchadnezzar was or is in the Bible, I think I mentioned last week, when King Nebuchadnezzar comes to town and he lays siege to Jerusalem, and he's there, by the way, it was almost 3 years, just short of 3 years that he was there laying siege. That means he's just starving everybody in there to the point where the king decides he's going to make a run for it, even though God said don't do that. They knock a hole in the wall. The king and some of his soldiers, they run in the middle of the night, and the Chaldeans capture him, the Babylonians, Chaldeans capture him, and they bring him and his family in front of Nebuchadnezzar, and there Nebuchadnezzar holds the king up, makes him watch as he slaughters every one of his family in front of him, and then they poke out his eyes and put him in chains, carry him off to the prisons of Babylon, and that's the last time that king ever saw anything and did anything. That was it for him. That's the kind of guy. Now, we listen to stories like that, and we're like, yeah, he's a king. That's what kings do. So you get an idea. I got a much better way of representing this guy to us today, and we'll get a better image of who he is. There is a guy in our modern life, in our day and age, who considered himself to be Nebuchadnezzar reincarnated, if you didn't notice. In fact, he ruled his own country and started using the name Nebuchadnezzar whenever he could. This happened in our lifetime. He actually took his money and started printing the image of Nebuchadnezzar on his money. That's how much he enjoyed it, how much he worshiped it. And you realize Nebuchadnezzar is always a picture of Satan in the Bible too. So this guy is so evil, and we would call him today a name you would know. His name is Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein believed himself to be Nebuchadnezzar reincarnated. Now, if you don't know anything about Saddam Hussein, you've been living in the dirt for a while, let me just help you out here. He was a mass murderer. He was an evil man. He did things that were just atrocious. I had a friend of mine that worked for the Navy Seabees down in Florida, and he was over there during this time period, and one of his jobs as being the engineering corps for the Navy is they pulled him aside. He drove the heavy equipment, and he actually dug up mass graves of women, children. They were just murdered, buried to death. And I say all that horrifically not to glorify it, but I want you to know what kind of guy this is. This is the Nebuchadnezzar we're dealing with. That was his role model. This guy's as evil can be. So don't read through the book of Daniel and go, he was just the king doing his thing. No, he was evil. He was evil. And he has another dream. Surprise, surprise. And if you're not sure about the dreams he had, you can go back to chapter 2 and read that dream. That was a whole big story. But in chapter 4, he has this dream. And what's different about chapter 4 is we find Nebuchadnezzar telling his own story. This is his personal story telling you straight from his own mouth or writing. And so what you need to know, though, about Nebuchadnezzar, not just that the fact he's evil, he's the Saddam Hussein of his day, or actually Saddam Hussein wishes he was Nebuchadnezzar, is he actually, this guy, if you read through chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3 of Daniel, what you find is this evil king Nebuchadnezzar actually saw the hand of God work. I mean, it wasn't stories. He saw 4 men in the fire, chapter 3. That's important you know that. He looks out and says, hey, there's a 4th guy in there, and he looks like a god. And they brought these 3 men out, these 3 Hebrew men, the friends of Daniel, and he says, wait a minute, they didn't get burned up, their clothes aren't singed, and you know what? They don't even smell like smoke. He saw the working of God. He saw God move, and he saw God do this enough that he even, and this is so strange, you have to know this before we get into this chapter, he even leaned in a little bit as a guide. Now, don't ever confuse, as you read through the book of Daniel, don't ever confuse the fact that you think he's a Christ follower. He's not. He says some nice things about God, but he is never a follower of God. But he leans in so much to make you believe that he almost could be. He leans in and he leans towards the things of God and says some pretty amazing things. And that's the setting of Daniel chapter 4. Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar starts at the very beginning, the first 12 verses, and he tells you that there's amazing things that God is working in his life. And then he says, this is what happened. I had a dream and it scared me to death. And I'm cutting through some tape. And he tells him about this dream where he's had this vision in this dream of this tree that grows up to be this massive tree that reaches to the heavens and it spreads its limbs out. And all the birds of the air make nests in the tree and all the animals come under this tree. And then he says he hears this voice of the Holy One, this messenger of the Holy One, and it comes down and it says, cut the tree down. And that happens. And but leave a stump, and they leave this stump. And then he makes this prediction about the fact that there would be this guy who's going to end up having to sleep and have dew on him, which means he basically is going to have to sleep out under the stars. And he's going to wander around, and he's going to lose his mind. His mind's going to become like an animal. And he's going to do this for 7 times or 7 years. And he has this dream, and he does what he did the last time. He calls all of his counselors in, his superstitious guys. There were guys who read the tea leaves, the guys who read the tarot cards, the guys who are astrologers, astronomers, worshipers of devil, worshipers of whatever, New Age astrologers. He does everything. He looks at his horoscope every morning to see if they can find out. And nobody can until Daniel's called in. And so we pick up in verse 13. He starts in verse 13, he starts telling Daniel. And what's amazing about this is this dream that rattles the king, the interpreters that he calls in, they couldn't. And really, I want you to think like this. I believe it wasn't couldn't. Now, I know the Bible says couldn't. That's Nebuchadnezzar's view. But I believe they wouldn't tell him the interpretation. Because I think when you read this, you're going to be like, this is pretty clear what's happening here. It wasn't a hard one to interpret. But Daniel's going to do what's right. And Daniel's going to put his life on the line by standing up to the king who has the power to kill him, who has the power to end his life. If nothing else, he could make his life so miserable. And that's what they did in this country. They threw people in fiery furnaces. They threw people in lions' dens. They did things that were just unbelievable. They killed kings, they put kings' eyes out after they killed their kids. So do you think Daniel's in a safe place? Absolutely not. But look what Daniel does. It says in verse 13, as we pick up the story here, in verse number 13, it says, in the visions I saw, this is Nebuchadnezzar's own words, I saw while lying in bed, I looked, and there before me was a holy one, a messenger coming down from heaven. Verse 14, he called out in a loud voice, cut down the tree and trim off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Verse 15, let the animals flee from under it and the birds from its branches. But let the stump and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground and the grass of the field. Let him be drenched with dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times pass by for him. Verse 17, the decision is announced by messengers, the Holy One declared the verdict, so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth, and gives them to anyone he wishes, and sets over them the lowliest of people. Verse 18, this is the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, had. Now, Belteshazzar, and just to remember, Belteshazzar was the name for Daniel that the Babylonians assigned him. We don't really call him that. It says, now, Belteshazzar, tell me what it means, for none of the wise men in my kingdom can interpret it for me. But you can, because the spirit of the holy gods is in you. Now, you see the vague issue there as we look back in verse 18. He says the spirit of the holy gods is in you. Now, that should be clear enough evidence to understand he isn't talking about, he doesn't believe in God Almighty, one God. He's pantheon of gods, right? Pantheon of gods. And part of the mindset for Nebuchadnezzar, just so you understand, is Nebuchadnezzar's like, I already defeated Judah. I conquered all the world, so how good could their God be? Because I beat him. That's how he thought. And so he's told this whole dream sequence, and be honest with you, I think when Daniel hears this, and you remember what he just got done saying, the wise men in my kingdom can't interpret it for me, but you can. Now, why do you believe that? Because Daniel had been doing these outstanding things. One of the gifts that Daniel had received from God was the fact that Daniel could interpret dreams. And he was good at it. In fact, God even gave him the dream in chapter 2, told him the dream that Nebuchadnezzar would not repeat to anybody else. And so this is the circumstance we have, but I believe what Daniel hears, he's really sad. I believe this changes his whole outlook on life. I believe he is disheartened. And when I read through this, I was thinking, like, this is crazy. Because when you see Daniel in action here, I think Daniel, he's going to portray this whole issue, and he's going to act like he's very sorry about this whole situation here. And I thought about this, interpreting dreams, that's got to be a tough, rough thing. I looked it up in psychology books, and maybe you haven't. I don't know. My wife told me one time, because I don't seem like I have a lot of dreams. My wife says, everybody dreams. You just may not remember them. So I guess I'm going to have to go on that one. My memory doesn't work at night either. But if you've had dreams before, now I've had a few dreams I remember, but most of them I don't remember much. But I was reading through, and maybe this is just for interest here on dream interpretation. I don't know where, other than God's power, Daniel had his insight. But according to psychology, this is some interesting things here. According to psychology, these are examples of dream interpretations from psychology today. If you dream that you're falling, I don't know if I've had that dream before. Anybody ever dream that they're falling in their dream and you just keep falling and falling? Okay, I'm the only one. So I guess maybe I just skip that one now. If you dream that you're falling, it actually, according to psychology, means that you have something that you can't control. Okay, that might be true in my case. I've had that one a few times. They said if you dream that you forgot an exam or a test or a project or something that was a responsibility that you had at work, you forgot it and you're just panicked that you forgot it. It means the interpretation of that is that you aren't prepared. That seems about right. If you dream that you're stuck, maybe you're in a car and it's stuck or whatever, it means, according to psychology, there again, not God's word, according to psychology, it means that you are overwhelmed in your life, and that's why you're dreaming about being stuck. If you dream about dirty water, I don't know who dreams about dirty water, but if you dream about dirty water in your dream, according to psychology, it means that you are actually sick. Your body's way of telling you that you're sick, and so if you dream about dirty water, you're sick. Some of you guys are going to go home and have some of these dreams now because I mentioned it. But anyway, here's one for all you women. If you dream about chocolate, anybody dream about chocolate? M&Ms, peanuts in them. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. If you dream about chocolate, that means, according to psychology, not God's word, but some of you guys are going to wish it was God's word, it means that you deserve to be rewarded. I don't know. Here's one that a lot of people have. If you dream about the fact that you have to go to the bathroom in your dream, you know what that means? You have to go to the bathroom, so get up and go to the bathroom. That's what it means, or you might have a problem. That's true. Um, and the last one, a lot of people have this one. If you dream that you're naked in your dream, it means that you're insecure. That's what they say. Now, once again, that's not Bible there. That's just psychology, what psychology says. Daniel, I think he's got a better perspective because Daniel's getting his information from God, and that's how we have to respect that and respond to it. But Daniel, he sits back, and he hears this dream that maybe you sat back and thought it was crazy, but it really, if you read through the book of Daniel, you're going to say, this makes a lot of sense. It's not that hard to figure out what is going on here. And Daniel, and this is what surprised me, Daniel, in such a loving way, he comes up with this interpretation, and he begins to say this. In verse number, he does this because of this statement here I want to make. Daniel's going to stand up to the king, because that's what we're talking about. He stands up to the king, not only because it's the right thing to do, but Daniel stands up to the king, the ruler right now of the whole world, because he wants the king to know God. And that's so amazing here. Now, why is that amazing? Because Daniel, at the age of 14, 15, saw his family murdered by that king. Daniel, at age 14, 15, was ripped away from everything he knew. All of his family, his friends, all of his home life, his history, everything that you could. They tried to reprogram him. They changed his name. Remember all those things we talked about that week? And so if I were Daniel, if you were Daniel, what would he feel like towards King Nebuchadnezzar? Good, you're getting what you deserve, you filthy, rotten sinner. Isn't that how we'd feel probably? But Daniel doesn't have that because he wants so badly for his king to know who God is. Daniel chapter 4, verse 22, we pick up. Daniel's given the interpretation. This is what he says. Your Majesty, you are that tree. You are that tree. That's an interesting thing. Can you imagine, like, you are the man. I get when Nathan points at David and says, you're the man. But here's a prophet going, you're the tree. You're the tree. And he says, that dream you had, in that dream that you grew up and got so big and you spread out your arms, he says, you have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown until it reaches the sky, and your dominion extends to distant parts of the earth. And that's pretty easy there. He says, hey, let me help you out. And then he goes on, skip down a couple of verses 25 and 26. Verse 25, he says, you, king, this is the interpretation, you will be driven away from people. You're on your own, and you will live with the wild animals. That was that whole part that they were talking about in the dream. You will eat grass like the ox and be drenched with the dew of heaven. Not mountain dew, the dew of heaven. 7 times, and that would, in biblical talk, that would be 7 years. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High, and when he uses that term, he's talking about one God specific, not any God, the Most High, Elohim, God Almighty, is sovereign. Now, you may not use that word a lot, but that just means when we talk about sovereignty, we're just saying God has the power to do whatever he wants to do. And he says, you will learn this, that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. Now, if I'm Daniel, that was pretty bold what he said, true, and I just close my Bible and walk away, right? Because that was enough confrontation for me. Because remember, most of us, we don't like confrontation. Or that was, for those of you who like the drive-by confrontations, you give them the drive-by truth, and it's hurt, and you're getting it, king, because the tree's getting cut down, and you're the guy, and you sort of just walk away. But Daniel doesn't. That's what, Daniel could have stopped anytime he wanted to. Daniel could have just sat there and said, you know what, that's it. He goes on, verse 26, he says, the command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored when you acknowledge the heaven rules. Oh, it's getting tougher here to go on. Daniel could have said, hey, did my job. That's what God called. I'm a prophet. God called me to do that. That's all I had to do. But he doesn't stop there. Instead, Daniel does something that's so crazy. He could have just stopped with the interpretation of the dream, because that's what I told Daniel to do, because your life's in the balance here, Daniel. Don't press your luck. King Nebuchadnezzar put a lot of people to death just for the fun of it. But notice what Daniel does, verse 27. He's given an interpretation. Verse 27, he says, therefore, your majesty, be pleased to accept my advice. Daniel, You getting out of telling the truth and now you're getting into advice? Hey, let him call Dr. Phil if he needs advice. But Daniel loves him enough that he's not going to do that. And look what he says. He says, here's my advice to you, king, great king of the earth, king that thinks he's got all the power. He says, renounce your sins by doing what's right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that then your prosperity will continue. Wow. Wow. I mean, have you ever read that before and said, wow, what is Daniel doing? This guy deserves death, doesn't he? He's a wicked, evil guy. Let God take care of him. That's how we feel most of the time, vindicated. Like, yeah, God punishes those people. Because how many of us would want that to happen to abortion clinic doctors? How many of us have wanted it to happen to maybe the LGBTQ plus community? And the truth of the matter is God doesn't want that to happen. And Daniel understood that. Daniel took it to heart here. And he's confronting him because he's going to stand up in the right way, at the right time, for the right reasons. And it's going to make all the difference here. Because when we look at this, we find a Daniel who's not just hitting somebody blindsided with truth and saying, let God sort him out. Now, Daniel wants one thing. He wants the king to know God, the king of everything. And when we look at this, what we have to realize is when we stand up and we confront people in the right way, and we are called to do that. We are called to stand up for God, not really for God. We're called to stand up for the truth. We've got to learn to do it the way the Bible talks about it. And the Apostle Paul helps us out with this over in Galatians chapter 6. One verse I want to give you out of the New Testament. In Galatians chapter 6, Paul says this. He says, brothers and sisters, speaking to Christians, he says, brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, that would be Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel's case, wasn't it? If someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit, only the people who live by the Spirit. If you're living in the works of the flesh, you're doing things the way you think they should be done, then it doesn't work for you. But he says, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person, and notice the next word, gently. But watch yourselves, or you may also be tempted. When I look at this in this verse, I think Paul helps us here in this situation understand what Daniel is doing. And you'll get it here in a second. Because I think what he's teaching us here to do is when we stand up, use prayerful confrontation to deal with issues in our time. And this is really what Daniel's doing here. He gives us two views out of this verse in Galatians chapter 6, verse 1. Two prayers that we ought to pray when we're confronting somebody. The first prayer is this. God, help me confront with the goal of restoration. See, remember Daniel? Daniel wanted his king to know his God. And he wanted to restore a relationship that wasn't there. He wanted to help them get together. And I think that's one of the first things whenever you have to confront somebody with the truth. And we should be truthful people. We should be like Jesus, where he was 100% grace, 100% truth all the time. And yes, he said things that were hard, but he said it in a loving way. Why? Because Jesus wanted to restore people in a right relationship with God, his Father, too. And that's what Daniel said. Look back in Galatians chapter 6, the first part of it. Notice what he said. You who live by the Spirit. You know what that makes me think? That there are Christians who don't actually live by the Spirit. That's sad. We take things in our own hands. We do things the traditional way. We do things the way we feel like they should be going. Hey, you know what? We should be led by the Spirit of God. Led by the Spirit. You who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. But that's not how we usually do it, is it? Let's do some church discipline on this guy because he's not right. Let's take him out. Let's celebrate the fact that we taught them how it is to deal with sinners. Hey, you know what? We're all sinners. And when we start having grace and mercy on other people, we're going to be more like Jesus was. I always think about that woman who was caught. She was caught in the very act. Well, where's the man? Caught in the very act of adultery, and she's thrown at the feet of Jesus early in the morning at the Temple Mount, trying to embarrass Jesus. And they're saying, hey, you know what the law says? Sinners have to be stoned. And I'm still thinking, where was the guy? How unfair is this? And they weren't trying to be fair. They weren't looking to do anything good. They were going to sacrifice a woman so they could get the Savior. That's what they were trying to do. But Jesus, hey, he can't stop him because he wrote the law. Jesus looks up and says, you know what, you're right. We ought to stone her. In fact, the person who has no sin, why don't you throw the first stone? And you know the story. They all dropped their stones and walked off because they all knew they were sinners. In fact, speculation's been that one of them was actually the guy that was caught in adultery. It was a set-up trap. They had enticed this woman. And Jesus looks to the woman and says, hey, woman, where are your accusers? And she says, they're gone. And he says, go and sin no more. I'm not accusing you either. Go and sin no more. You're guilty, but I'm going to forgive you, because he wanted to restore her to a right relationship gently. Gently. Maybe we ought to circle that word in the Bible. Gently. We don't need to kick down doors. We don't have to spit and shout. We don't have to protest everything. And that's what Daniel wanted for King Nebuchadnezzar. King, you are living in sin. And you could change this. So turn away from your sin. Do some works of kindness. Change your wickedness to kindness. Change your sin to helpfulness. Change who you are to meet the God who is in control of everything. That's the story. So the first prayer we should pray is, pray, God, help me to confront with restoration. But the second prayer that we find here in this verse is, God, help me confront with caution. And this is a much tougher thing, because some of us, we love to confront. We do. Honestly, there are some people that, they don't have a problem. Well, I'm going to tell it how it is. It is what it is. I'm going to tell it what it looks like. You know what Paul says in that verse in Galatians, in the second half of chapter 6, verse 1, he says, but watch yourselves. He just told us to restore gently, but he says, hey, watch yourselves, or you also may be tempted. Uh-oh. Why would he say that? He says, you know what? The act of confrontation sometimes, especially in those who think they're more than they are, causes us to be filled with pride. See, it would have been easy for Daniel to look at Nebuchadnezzar and say, you know what, Nebuchadnezzar? You're beneath me because I'm closer to God than you are. You're not on an equal basis with me, and you better do something. And you know what? That would have caused Daniel to be lifted up with pride. And what Paul's telling us here is, hey, you know what? When you confront somebody, you better use some caution in your confrontation, or pride's going to fill your life. Pride's going to be the problem. And that's such an issue, because when we do these things, not only does our approach matter, and that's so important to us, we have to realize that we as confronters are vulnerable to pride, is what God says. We need to realize we are all under God. Every one of us. There's no one better. And if you're here today and you're visiting, or you haven't ever realized this, there are no perfect people in here, from the pastor on down. I don't care how long they've been saved. I don't know how many Bibles they've worn out or anything. We're all sinners, saved by grace, and anything good in us isn't us. It's Jesus Christ. In fact, the greatest thing I can say about my life is, when God looks at me, he doesn't see me. He sees the blood of Jesus Christ, the righteousness of Jesus Christ. And that gives me hope. Because every morning I wake up and I realize how scarred and failed I am. And I know sometimes we come to church and we dress nice and we smile nice and we act nice. But deep down inside of us, there's an ugly, rotten person. And that's just the truth. My best version of me is Jesus Christ in me, the hope of glory. And that's what Daniel realized as he tried to unite his king. But here's the problem. You can want to restore, you can confront, just like Daniel did, with all the love in your heart, to help unite him to Nebuchadnezzar, to his God. But you know what? As Daniel did that, it didn't help. Because Nebuchadnezzar, the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey tells, Nebuchadnezzar didn't turn his heart to God. You go on in Daniel, back over in Daniel chapter 4, verse number 28, this is what it says. And remember, these are words from Nebuchadnezzar himself. He says, all this happened, all the things that you just heard, this all happened to Nebuchadnezzar. In verse 29, he says, 12 months later. So it was a year. A year goes by, and the guy forgets how quickly we forget things. A year goes by as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. And remember, Babylon contained one of the wonders of the ancient world. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon were considered one of the magnificent architectural sites of the world. So he's a good master builder. He's built his empire. In fact, he was in chapter 2, Kingdom of Babylon was the golden head. They were the greatest kingdom to ever exist, according to what the prophecy shows. Says, this is what he says. As he looks out from his rooftop, as he's walking along, he says, Is not this the great Babylon I have built at the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty? He forgot what was going on. Verse 31, it says, even as the words were on his lips, a voice came from heaven. That's a scary thing. This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. Verse 32, you will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox. 7 times, 7 years will pass by you. For until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. That's the sad truth there. Immediately, what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from the people and ate grass like his ox. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew so long it was like a feather of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. He was weird. He was that crazy guy in the woods. And that's how they left him. But you know what? God's grace is everlasting. His mercy is everlasting. And this is what happens. You skip down to verse 34. Verse 34, at the end of that time, the end of 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar, he raised his head his eyes towards heaven. He says, my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored, glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. Now, the sad truth is Nebuchadnezzar has a moment where he leans into God, but he never really comes to know God, and that is sad. But still, the focus of this is how do we stand up in the right way at the right time for the right reasons? Daniel, that's as simple. Daniel learned to prayerfully confront people. Daniel did what was right and trusted God with the results. What's the bottom line for us? Here it is. If I'm going to sum it up today, to stand up for us means to do what is right. It's never right to do wrong. Even in order to get a chance to do what's right. It's never right to do wrong. You understand that? It's never okay. Well, I had to get some beer and it's never right. To stand up means to do what's right. But don't sacrifice other people just so you can be right. Because God doesn't call you to be right. God never called you to be right. You know that. And that's where we have the problem with confrontation. We're supposed to trust God with the results.